Chapter 11 is going to look at some other types of victimization. And we're going to start off with stalking. The term stalker is first coined in the 80s. And the first legislation comes in California in 1990. By 1994, all states have criminalized stalking behavior. Probably the one that we are most familiar with is celebrity stalking, even though it's relatively rare. Whereas prior relationship stalking is much more common. There are very few stalking charges nationally each year, and most victims are women, and offenders are often ex-boyfriends, ex-husbands, people who are jealous and possessive. So in a nationwide survey where they looked at stalking over the course of a lifetime, over 5 million women disclosed in 2011 that they had been stalked. 15%, so that's come out to 15% of women, 6% of men have been stalked. 30% of murdered women were stalked by former intimate partners before being murdered. So what are the elements of stalking? And this is going to be defined differently in each state. What we're basically looking at a victim who has a reasonable fear of death or grave bodily injury, and that there's a credible threat of violence. So what are ways we can reduce the risk of stalking? I heard somebody talk about this once in a way that was pretty interesting. So you don't want to repeatedly tell somebody to desist, to stop their behavior. You want to tell them once and then break off contact. A stalker will see it as if it takes them 40 times of stalking you or contacting you to get you to respond, then they will often see that as, 40 times is what it takes to get you to respond. They're not going to see it the way you see it as like, finally they'll get it. It's also important to keep a log or a journal documenting any acts of harassment and intimidation. Other things we should do is formulate a plan that will, help provide your safety at home, traveling, and while at work. And then whatever options you have for protection, orders of protection or prosecution within both the criminal and civil justice systems, you want to exercise those as well. So what are some self-protective measures? One is to report the crime. Another is to keep any corroborating evidence. As I mentioned, getting a restraining order, have your phone number unlisted. You can also try to trap incoming calls, change your locks, vary your daily routine, and unfortunately, some victims find it necessary to have to move. So cyber stalking is online harassment, a type of online abuse, and it's using internet or electronic communications to convey those threats. Police often lack resources to investigate this. They're often multi-jurisdictional issues, and so you'll have a multi-jurisdictional task force. Also, most police departments do not have the necessary training or skills or education in order to deal with cybercrimes in general. Prosecutors also lack resources to prosecute. Only 16% of prosecutors nationwide charged someone in 2001, but by 2005, 36% had. So another special type of victimization is crimes that occur at school. We often tend to think of school shootings and mass murders at schools, but the most common offenses that occur at school are not those types of offenses. They are larcenies and bullying and assaults. So non-reporting continues to be a problem here, and the thing that is most accurately counted are, of course, these school shootings. So often a single horrific outbreak accounts for most of the deaths of students in a given year. And so we can see these rates of victimization per 1,000 students from 1992 up through 2012. And here we can also see a bar graph too. Trends of murders of students at middle schools and high schools. In terms of campus violence, we touched upon this a little bit in the chapter on sexual assault, but college campuses are relatively safe, and the most prevalent crime on a college campus is larceny. It's going to be a theft. Property crimes are much more common than violent crimes. And here we could see kind of the breakdown of those, index crimes, the Part 1 crimes. And notice these are not rates, these are incidents per year. Hazing on campus is illegal, but a lot of times these traditions are tolerated by undergrads as part of campus life. We see this in athletics, fraternities, and sororities, performing arts groups. They often involve alcohol consumption, humiliation, sleep deprivation, and unfortunately, sometimes sex acts are common practices as well. In a survey of 50 colleges of 14,000 undergrads, about 50% of clubs, teams, and organization members had experienced hazing. 9 out of 10 who had been through hazing did not consider themselves to have been abused, and 95% did not report this to a college official. But a quarter of coaches, advisors, and alumni were aware of the hazing that went on and the activities that they supervised. We also have workplace violence. So this could be being killed on the job or being assaulted on the job. So when we think about being killed on the job, we often think of law enforcement, cab drivers, being assaulted on the job, again, law enforcement, people who work in mental health. The safest job is that of college professor. So I have been both a worker in a mental health field where I was assaulted regularly and in the safest job now where I am never assaulted. Knock on wood. Workplace violence is a term coined in 1989. Before this, people would talk about, quote unquote, going postal, based on the idea of a disgruntled post office worker going in and shooting, engaging in a shooting in his workplace. There's different threat assessment strategies, things we can do. We could try to reduce the odds that an intruder can actually come into the workplace. So when I was actually still taking classes in my PhD program, we had a threat against one of our students by their soon-to-be ex-spouse. And the building was locked down regularly between certain hours where people couldn't get into the office space without getting buzzed in by someone else. You can also try to prevent outside disputes from coming into the workplace. We also want to protect employees who are in a position to deal with irate customers, students, disturbed patients, and inmates, and to safeguard employees from disgruntled current or former employees. We also think about bias and hate crimes. 1990, we have the Hate Crime Statistic Act. The FBI starts gathering data annually on bias crimes. In 2012, they reported 6,600 hate crimes, with race being the most common motivation and mainly against African Americans. 20% for religious, 20% for sexual preference, and 10% ethnic motivation, and that's also mainly against Jewish people. Fewer than 50% of all bias-driven incidents are actually reported to the police. Another more common topic we've heard about in recent times is officers that are injured or killed in the line of duty. From your author, we have, quote, as the first line of defense for social order, law enforcement agents serve as a lightning rod, attracting and absorbing the bolts of discontent emanating from alienated individuals and hostile groups within society. These are often considered to be amongst the most heinous of all crimes, and they're often punishable by death in states that have the death penalty. In here, we could see a bar graph showing us the number of officers killed in the line of duty from over a 40-year period here. And we can see that it is decreasing. The number of deaths peaked in 1973, dropped in the 80s, and has become fairly stable. So it's interesting when you think about one of the times an officer is most likely to be killed. And certainly an ambush situation makes the most sense. And as does an arrest, but we also want to remember that traffic pursuits and traffic stops are also very dangerous for police officers. If you've been pulled over, you often may think, oh, why is this police officer acting so stern or being so strict or giving me a hard time? But remember, that officer doesn't know you from a hole in the wall. They don't know that you're a good, kind-natured person. Ted Bundy was caught during a traffic stop. So think about that. At any given moment, a police officer can be pulling somebody over who poses a serious danger to them. When we look at murdered officers, overwhelmingly they're male and white. About 12% were black. They're often between the ages of 25 and 40. Federal law enforcement officers, however, do not have the greatest risk. So DEA, Marshals, ATF, Homeland Security. Terrorism is also a rather timely topic. This is violence in the form of bombing, suicide missions, assassinations, kidnapping for ransom, hostage taking, and airplane hijacking. The FBI reports from 1980 to September 2001 that there were 327 incidents and 239 were committed by domestic groups. So while we often see the portrait of a terrorist as being a Muslim from another country, they're much more often white men here from the U.S. In the 10 years following 2001, not a single person on U.S. soil has been killed or wounded in a, quote, genuine 9/11 type terrorist attack. Pre 9/11. So those of you that are in DAPS will probably remember this incident. Those of you that are day students probably won't. But the worst bombing prior to that is the one in Oklahoma City in 1995. That occurred, and there was a daycare in that building. That's Nichols and McVeigh. And that's a truck that's made with a fertilizer bomb. And then the one that's probably most memorable is, of course, September 11th. And here we can see a big spike. This chart is actually important. And it kind of gives us an idea of things to think about when we're reporting data and reporting statistics. That when we have unusual events, we want to make sure that we're highlighting that. Because if you look at, 2001, we could see, wow, there's an enormous peak. So if we were to, talk about the increase from 2000 to 2001, we would have a really astounding number. But we want to remember that we have a really big, one really big incident there. Okay, and that wraps up our chapter on additional victim groups.